All right, well, howdy y'all. My name is Kathryn Edwards. I'm an associate economist at the RAND Corporation, and I'm happy to moderate this final panel, which is on revenue options for Social Security going forward. I've been a member of the Academy National Academy of Social Insurance since 2016, and in my younger years, I wrote the Young Person's Guide to Social Security, which is on display out front. I am, of course, very heartbroken that I'm now here as an economist and instead of as a young person, which I no longer have expertise. That stings a bit, but I'm still happy to be at the table. So we have 3 presentations for you today. The first will be Ben Veghte, who is the Vice President of Policy at NACI, and he's going to talk about the threat that inequality poses to Social Security revenue in the long term. We'll follow that by Ken Buffin, who is the research director of the Buffin Institute and an actuary. And then finally, we'll have Peter Diamond, the Institute Professor Emeritus at MIT and Nobel laureate, to talk to us about the estate tax. And just as before, we'll have questions at the end. So Ben, if you want to start.
Hello, everyone. I just wanted to start by thanking the team at the National Academy of Social Insurance, particularly Elliot Skur, who took the lead in organizing this event, so thank you very much. And I also want to thank the rest of our team and AARP staff as well, particularly Ramsey Alwyn and Joel Eskovitz, who helped us make this happen, so thank you. I also wanted to note that the Academy does not take positions on specific policy reform proposals. We don't endorse specific proposals, neither as an organization nor do I in my role as Vice President at the Academy. So the purpose of my talk today, I was asked to simply sort of brainstorm with the other members of our panel on ideas to generate discussion around ideas for reforming Social Security's revenue structure. So the idea that I'm going to be talking about today will end up being about incorporating investment income into the contribution and benefit base of Social Security. But the broader topic is, what are the implications of inequality for Social Security's revenue design? As Olivia Mitchell noted earlier, currently scheduled revenues are insufficient to fund currently scheduled benefits. So unless something is done on the revenue side, either by adopting one of the ideas presented on this panel or some other idea, we could end up having benefit cuts. So it's an important issue to take on. Today we've talked about a range of secular trends that have affected Social Security relating to the family structure, changes in the labor market. And the one we're talking about today on this panel, in my talk in particular, is slow and unequal wage growth, which has been going on for decades and poses 2 challenges to Social Security as a system. First of all, it hurts system finances, which I'll describe a little bit later on, and that the effects of that on the finances of the program could end up resulting in benefit cuts. So it's a serious threat. And the other aspect is that lower wages ultimately leads to slow wage growth leads to lower retirement benefits through Social Security than would otherwise have been the case if we had shared prosperity. So inequality affects Social Security in multiple ways. So next slide, please. Let's take a step back and consider the origins of Social Security. It was part of a mid-20th century social contract. It was a response to the inequalities of the 1920s, and in particular to the insecurities that accompanied the Great Depression. The mid-century social contract of which Social Security was a part helped ensure shared prosperity for 30 years. It had multiple aspects to it. Social Security was only one. The Social Security program was only one. But of course, there were also other parts of the Social Security Act that were critical: unemployment insurance, AFDC, but also collective bargaining rights, massive investments in infrastructure, housing, education throughout the 40s and 50s as well, were all part of a social contract that generated shared prosperity in a virtuous cycle of economic growth, shared economic growth in that golden age that ended in the 1970s. And Social Security was expanded multiple times during those years. Next slide, please. So since 1979, things haven't been quite as rosy. We've had a period of slow and unequal wage growth. Because of time constraints, I won't go into all of the various causal factors, but you're familiar with them, I'm sure. They were partly economic drivers and partly political choices. But taken together, economic factors and political choices led to asymmetric capital-labor power relations, which sounds like an old-fashioned term, but it's still quite analytically insightful and relevant, which directed a larger share of income to owners of capital and to high-level managerial employees. Now, there are long debates in the field of economics about the distribution of income and how that has changed in recent decades, but pretty much everyone agrees that there's been a modest decline in the labor share of national income and a tremendous growth in inequality within labor income. So if we look just at the share of capital going to households at different places in the income spectrum, the share of total income from capital accruing to the top 1% was 33.2% in 1979. And in 2013, over half of income from capital went to the top 1% of the income spectrum. So the story here is that income from capital is highly concentrated at the top and has become much more so in recent decades. So what is the impact of slow and unequal wage growth on Social Security's finances? Social Security contributions are due only on the first $127,200 of earned income. Of course, that goes up every year. Only the bottom 94% of earners pay contributions on all their earnings, and investment income is not subject at all to Social Security contributions. Higher earners pay contributions to Social Security neither on their earnings above the cap nor on their investment income. And since most income growth in recent decades has been at the top, that the growth in national income, much of the growth of national income is escaping the Social Security system's contribution base, right? So that hurts our finances. Income inequality also is a causal factor driving disparate longevity, which itself is another factor which hurts Social Security's finances because those with higher benefits live longer and those with lower benefits die earlier. Next slide, please. So Social Security needs a revenue base that grows with the economy. Benefits are indexed to growth in average wages in the economy. Initial benefits are. And when earnings above the cap grow faster than earnings below the cap, then initial benefits are growing faster than revenue flowing into the system. In the 1977 amendments, Congress took explicit measures to ensure that taxable payroll, the share of covered earnings subject to contributions, would reach 90% by 1983, and it did. But now, since then, it's dropped to the low 80s. So what are some policy options to deal with the implications of slow and unequal wage growth for Social Security's revenue design? I know Session 2 talked about implications for benefits, but here we're talking about revenues. So the first thing is the implication would be to adopt policies that stimulate, wage growth, shared wage growth, wage growth in the middle and lower end of the wage distribution, achieving greater shared prosperity. There are many ways to do this, and it goes beyond the scope of the paper to touch on them all. Obviously, anything that pushes us towards full employment raises wages. Lowering healthcare costs, infrastructural investments are considered to be a factor that could help there. But the bottom line is that generating strong wage growth is the best Social Security revenue policy. Before any other tweaks to the Social Security contributions or adopting other sources of revenue for Social Security, if we simply improve wages and shared wage growth, that's the best Social Security revenue strategy. Another option would be to raise or eliminate the tax cap, obviously, so that the tax base captures more growth in earnings. And incorporating investment income is another option. Again, because the action in investment income is the top, in the top 1% or even a fraction thereof, the threshold where you start incorporating investment income into Social Security's contributions base could be fairly high. It could be $200 for individuals, $250 for households, et cetera. In either of the above cases, if you will raise the tax cap or incorporate investment income to some extent into Social Security's contribution base, a key social insurance principle would be to credit these additional contributions toward benefits. I know that this is something that some people don't propose, but I think as a social insurance principle, earnings-related benefits is key. Social insurance in the income security realm replaces a share of prior earnings. That's what it does. That's why it's social insurance. It insures wages. So if you're not crediting contributions toward benefits, then you are diminishing the social insurance character of Social Security. And finally, the estate tax is another option which Peter is going to be talking about. So what could a Social Security net investment income tax look like? So the ACA adopted what was called the Medicare net investment income tax, which is a misnomer because the money doesn't flow into Medicare. But it did set a precedent for social policy, taxing investment income to make possible expansions of social policy. Since 2013, the ACA levies a 3.8% tax on net investment income of those with modified adjusted gross income above 200K or 250K for couples. On the slide, you can see the definition of what net investment income is. I won't go into it here, but it also includes passive income from businesses. For Social Security, design would be more complicated than in the case of this tax because this tax simply flows into general revenues. Whereas in the case of Social Security, if you're going to credit contributions to toward benefits, you would have to find a way to incorporate these additional earnings into the Social Security benefit formula. In terms of the threshold that you use, you would need to use a household adjusted gross income threshold to determine whether people are subject to such a additional tax, if you will, because otherwise you could game the system by shifting income back and forth between spouses. If the earnings, but in any case, you'd have to also figure out how to attribute the income on which these contributions are made to individuals because it's household income, so you'd have to maybe split it between married couples or something like that. That's a design issue. It'd have to be figured out. If the earnings tax cap were raised or eliminated, so if we were to raise the cap or scrap the cap, then this issue of investment income becomes particularly important because the additional 6.2% tax on earnings above the current cap would create an additional incentive for sheltering income in passive income or investment income to evade the Social Security contribution. So if the tax cap in Social Security is raised significantly or scrapped altogether, then this issue is something that policymakers need to figure out. So next slide, please. What are some design issues in crediting contributions toward benefits? Well, there's no employer match on investment income, so you'd probably count half. So a 6.2% Social Security net investment income tax would actually be contributing to Social Security's finances only half the income that the 12.4% contribution does on labor income. So it would make sense if half of the net investment income were incorporated into an individual's income record and then incorporated into their PIA calculation. In conjunction with raising or eliminating the earnings tax cap and/or adopting a proposal like this, policymakers would also need to decide whether to use the 15% PIA factor, which is currently the top factor, or lower it or have a declining series of factors. In other words, otherwise, high-income individuals would get extraordinarily high benefits. So in conclusion, the economy and the distribution of gains from economic growth have changed radically over the past 4 decades, exacerbating income inequality and leading to greater levels of retirement income inadequacy than would have otherwise been the case if we'd had shared prosperity. So Social Security policy should keep pace with changes in the distribution of income as well as the other changes that we've been discussing today. Incorporating investment income into Social Security's contribution and benefit base is simply one means of doing so. There are many other means of doing so as well, and this presentation is simply meant to encourage discussion.
Good afternoon. Our theme of the conference today, from the title here, is New Approaches to Social Security, Adequacy and Solvency. And I see the title of this particular panel discussion is Ensuring Adequate Revenue for Social Security. So that makes my task very simple. I just have to concentrate on the revenue aspects, not worry about 2033 as Peter has warned us, and I don't have to worry about benefit cuts or changes in retirement age. I can speak just about the single issue of how do we get from where we are now to where we need to be so that we have adequate revenue. So my presentation or discussion will simply be about revenue enhancement. So let's start by considering the nature of the Social Security system. It is truly a dynamic system. We've got all kinds of built-in changes. We've got cost of living adjustments for benefits in course of payments. We've got several elements that are wage index. The career earnings of an individual are wage index. The PIA, primary insurance formula, is wage index. The bend points are wage indexed. The limit on Social Security contributions is also wage index. So we've got very much a dynamic system. However, if you step back and look at how it is financed, the principal sources of finance are the FICA contribution, or payroll tax, if you will, the investment income or interest income on the trust fund, and the taxation of benefits, that is some of it flowing back in, as well as the maturity proceeds of the trust fund. But the critical issue is that the payroll tax is fixed. So here we have a strange mixture. We have a system that is dynamic with all this change taking place year by year, and yet we're trying to finance it with a fixed payroll tax. Now, to me, that seems somewhat illogical. And the result has been that deficits have been created because the fixed payroll tax does not work over long term. It was set up, let us say, initially with the idea of being able to finance scheduled benefits over a projected 75-year period. All well and good if all the actuarial assumptions and all the experience works out exactly as anticipated. For those 75 years, the payroll tax, as determined by the actuaries, will be adequate. However, times change. We move from one 75-year projection period forward 1 year so that we're then measuring the projection requirements for years 2 through 76. Then we move forward and measure the requirements 3 through 77, et cetera, et cetera. Each of those 75-year periods have their own specific demographic and economic profiles. Year 76 is different from year 1. If you think about it, it may well be that just the life expectancy has changed. So we cannot possibly expect that a fixed contribution structure will work to finance something that is dynamic and changing through time. So we have to address the issue. How can we make the financing system itself adequate and dynamic, responding to the dynamic aspects of the benefit structure? So let's look at the primary sources of those deficits. The principal one, and the Office of the Chief Actuary publishes each year a so-called attribution analysis, very clearly is the addition of the out year. That is the primary additional element that creates the deficit. And then if there's some difference in experience on mortality or the birth rates or inflation, then there's a minor fluctuation adjustment there. But those are relatively small compared with the problem of the out years. So it is the adequate financing to address the changing dynamic aspects of the system that we need to fix. So we've got a 6.2% rate. What do we need? At 75 years, we need something close to 7.5%. But there's nothing magical about a 75-year projection. What we have seen is that the period of solvency has contracted from 75 years at the turn of the millennium. It was about 40 years. Now it's about 17 years. And if we don't do anything by 2033, it'll be 0. So perhaps we need to wake up and address the issue of how can we postpone that inevitable period that we don't have 1983 all over again in 2033. Let me just consult my notes to give you a specific measure of what is required for 25 years and what is required to establish the solvency at 50 years. And surprisingly, the increments are small and easily affordable. bear with me while I get the exact numbers. Otherwise, my actuarial friends in the audience will be criticizing me. Okay. As I said, it's about 7.5% is where we need to do for 75 years. Okay, the answer is 6.62% at 25 years. Very easy to get from 6.2 to 6.62. And it is 7.18% to get to 50 years. Now, bear in mind, these are both employer and employee, so really we're talking about doubling those amounts. And then 7.45 in 75 years. The Congressman Larson proposals, the Social Security Act 2100, has addressed that issue of getting us to around 7.4 or 7.5. And the way that he has suggested doing that is to increase the FICA tax in increments from the 6.2 by 0.1 until we get up to that particular level. Now, in retrospect, what would have been the smart thing to do back in 1983 would have been to have introduced a dynamic variable FICA tax rate. Instead of 6.2, just put an automatic adjustment increase of 0.05. So it would have increased from 620 to 625 to 630. We would now be exactly where we need to be. So in hindsight, it's easy to see what should have been done, but it's not too late to make those kind of changes. If we were to make a requirement, and this is the proposal that we're making, that at the time of the annual trustees report, we look at what would be the necessary increase in the payroll tax to get us to a 25-year level of solvency, 100% solvency. And the answer, as I say, is 6.62%. And then if we did that each and every year and reset automatically the payroll tax at that level, we would then achieve, as we've indicated, as requested in the particular mandate for this particular session, achieving the revenue enhancements to achieve full solvency. Now, the counter-argument is, well, will that just increase indefinitely? Will that grow to the sky? Will that grow to the limit that is unaffordable? I think the answer is no. We can buy 25-year solvency reasonably inexpensively. We can buy 50-year solvency reasonably inexpensively. And we can get the 75 years. So we're pushing out that inevitable 2033 year further and further out. The second part of the recommendation is that we stop and evaluate at the end of 10 years. Do not allow the increases to go above the annual increase for the next 10 years. Stop at that point and reevaluate. And it may be that at some point, 10 years, 20 years, 30 years down the road, we do have our 2033, and we do need to consider some other changes. But at least we can buy time by means of the dynamic payroll tax rate. So that is the essence of our proposal. Thank you.
I was asked to be on this panel because Peter and Orzag and I wrote that in our book a bit over a decade ago. And the context, which I still believe in, is Social Security is not the only part of the federal budget that's being underfinanced. And the reverse of starve the beast is if we got a whole lot more revenue, some of it would be well spent. And in particular, we said connecting the estate tax to Social Security is likely to help maintain it as a tax, which is continuously under attack, and we're in favor of doing it if it looks like that attack is real. We were not the only people to look at it. Just look down at the bold part. Bob Ball asked the Office of the Actuary to evaluate some reform and dedication of the estate tax to Social Security. And as you see, he found a significant impact back then. And is the estate tax under attack? You all know it is. That's the latest thing I found. And in terms of attitude toward tax revenue, I showed this one already. So I think it's important to have candidates that the public is more comfortable with taxing. A little background, obviously with the growth particularly of Medicare, but Medicare and Social Security, payroll taxes been an increasing fraction of federal revenues, corporate tax shrinking, and other, including the estate tax, shrinking. How big are the numbers here? Obviously, they go to two different scales. You see there is a noticeable impact, but it's been shrinking. Hopefully, one would reform the loopholes and bring it back up if we're doing this. And there is the ratio, historically, of estate tax revenue to OASDI payroll tax revenue, so it doesn't include the taxation of benefits. It's not huge, but it's big relative to the size of the actuarial imbalance. The other thing I want to spend a few minutes on is a long time ago, Thomas Paine proposed using the estate tax for, among other things, Social Security. So here was his proposal, 15 pounds as wealth to get you started with your career at age 21, and that was for both men and women. 10 pounds per annum with a retirement age of 50. You don't have to retire, it's just cash payment. And a disability program in the vocabulary used then. And then he tried to calculate how big an estate tax, now this was applying to everyone, would solve this problem. He wanted a 10% tax on estates that were going to sons and daughters, and an additional tax on estates that were being spread more widely. The French, by the way, have estate tax rates that vary with the relationship between bequeather. What interested me, and it's fun, that you can find this in lots of places on the web, including the Social Security website, is some of his vocabulary. The first one makes the point, this was for men and women. The second one makes the point this was supposed to go to everyone, like a social insurance program. And the third, he wanted this thought of as a right. That is, this is something everyone would have by right. It's not a charity, a term he used in some expressions. And then he talked about the extent to which there is a collective right to the inheritance. And he said land was created by the Creator. And at some point, we got private property, but the people who didn't get it on land, they should be entitled, their heirs should be entitled to something. And personal property is the effect of society. And he has, I didn't put it in, it's kind of long. If you gave a single person an entire continent, they couldn't accumulate a whole lot of wealth because it comes from society. I note the contrast with the way Elizabeth Warren made the same kind of statement, which is if you got very wealthy, the federal government provided the roads, educated the students. He's saying it's society did it for you and you owe it to society. An interesting wrinkle on how to put it. There it is, not a charity, but a right. And the other point, which I like because I think it's a political mistake and may even be an analytical mistake to think of inequality per se as the thing you want to address. What we want to address is what we want to collectively finance and how to divide the collective financing across people with different incomes and different wealths. And he obviously had the same attitude. He didn't mind people being rich as long as we were getting enough from them to make it worthwhile. And finally, the consistency of paying with a number of things, not just, forgot I had that slide. In the Netherlands, they have what is normally referred to as a non-contributory income. It goes to everybody over 65. They've just started pushing 65 up and will be automatically indexing it. It is set at a level that is the poverty line for the elderly. And so you get 100% of this benefit if you lived in the Netherlands for 50 years, proportional reductions. So if you've been there the whole time, your transfer is at the poverty line, and it goes to everybody. It is financed out of general revenues, although they have tagged an add-on to the income tax as labeled for this, but it's not big enough to finance it, and the rest comes from general revenue. So it was like tagging the estate tax for Social Security. I suspect, my Dutch is non-existent, was part of the selling when that tax came in. And to connect Thomas Paine with our current attitudes, I'm sure everybody knows the Wilbur Cohen quote, for you who can't see it behind me, a program that deals only with the poor will end up being a poor program. I think first of all, keeping Social Security important enough for enough of the profession, of the population is a big deal. And secondly, getting adequate revenues for it.
All right, I hope everyone thought of very good questions. What I was very excited about to moderate this panel is that when we talk about adequacy of benefits, we're often looking either at the current period or the past. Who hasn't gotten benefits? Who needs help now? What's not incorporated currently? But when we talk about revenue, we're also often talking far into the future of what should this program look like in 50 years and how should we expect it to pay for itself given how the economy changes. So what I like about each of these ideas is that they take a very different view of what the American economy will look like in 50 years, right? So Ben's proposal was to say that we need to expand Social Security, not only its financing, but also what counts as part of the investment into it. What I liked about Ken's proposal is that we just keep making the same mistake and that we don't need to really change that much except for make one part more dynamic. And what I like about Peter's proposal is that it's really taking the view that where our contributions to this insurance program comes from doesn't necessarily have to just be the workers themselves, and that there are other ways that we should think about investing into this population and how we think those will dominate. So, gentlemen, for the kind of visions of the economic future, as it were, what do you think we've left out? We haven't talked about contingent work and the increase in the number of filers that only have 1099 MISC as part of their income tax returns. We haven't talked about kind of the decentralization of work as it's moved forward, or any kind of broad question about what you think your proposal doesn't get at.
One of the elements that struck me in, again, looking at the 83 reform is from the beginning of Social Security through what was included in the 83 reform, there was always a future payroll tax rate increase that had been legislated. It wasn't indexed to anything, but it was always there. And 83 was the end of legislating to do that. So the idea of bringing back future payroll tax increases, chosen or indexed, is a way to go. And the indexing piece related to what you were bringing out that is interesting is the one in Canada. Canada has a significant fund invested worldwide, and their goal is for this fund to cover 20% of the annual expenditures, 80% coming from the pay-as-you-go part. And every 3 years, the Office of the Actuary does an evaluation I bet Steve Goss would love that rather than annually. And if it's out of balance over the projection period, I think it's 75, but off the top of my, if it's out of balance, there's a chance for legislation, and if legislation doesn't happen, the actuary invokes a decrease in the cost of living adjustments and an increase in the tax rate. So the idea here that beyond you're saying, let's do a fraction a year for a decade and then look at it, which is a sensible package. Another way to go is let's build some of the tax rate in automatically with what's happening on the spending.
There is one other element to my commentary that appears in your handout regarding the structure of the FICA tax rate, and that is that the 6.2% tax rate applies at all levels of income, currently up to a maximum of $127,200. That is truly a regressive tax. And so one of the other suggestions we have made is to reconstitute the FICA tax on a graduated scale. And there is a proposal in this particular commentary with some fairly modest adjustments. And you would basically get a fairly neutral position with a graduated rate, with 3 graduated rates. If you took the range covered from 0 to 127,200, just divided that into 3. On the lower third, put a tax rate of, say, 5%, and then a marginal tax rate on the middle third, 7.5%, and that would then create a maximum, I think, of 6.25, approximately equal to the 6.2 that is being paid currently, and then a marginal tax rate of 10% on that top third of the range. And the maximum rate for somebody at 127,200 would then only be 7.5%. And I think that is both affordable and reasonable and progressive and takes away the negative aspects of a regressive tax rate.
It's a very interesting idea. To answer your question, with regards to contingent work, I'm very concerned about that because, all net job growth since 2005 has been in contingent work, and there are a lot of forces at play there which suppress wages and will, serve to perpetuate this decades-long trend of stagnant wages for the bottom half of the income spectrum. So that exacerbates all the problems that I was discussing in my presentation. And I think we have to find creative ways of dealing with that. Some of the ideas I discussed in my presentation, other ideas would be adopting a way of having consumers of independent contractors provide matching contributions on a prorated basis to someone's Social Security contributions so that they can have a matching contribution, that they're not paying all of the self-employment tax themselves, but having a match from consumers. They do that in Germany in the Artists Fund. They have a social insurance fund for artists in Germany that does that for translators and other people who are doing graphic designers, et cetera. That's something that could be done here. Yeah.
My question is for all three of you, but in particular, Peter, in view of your luncheon keynote. You focused on the 83 amendments, and one of the big things they did was convert Social Security funding from completely pay-as-you-go to a trust fund that accumulated reserves. In the old days, it was a one-year reserve. Now it's $2.8 trillion. From all of your perspectives, does the trust fund get in the way of sensible revenue enhancements, and should we revisit that as well?
If you don't have a significant trust fund, then you slide into tending to tap into general revenues. And that, of course, makes much more vulnerable the benefit side. So first of all, I think having the dedicated revenues flowing through a trust fund is an important part. The public is confused that somehow the money isn't there because the government bonds that were held. I don't know how to deal with that confusion because it's been explained for as long as I've been involved in Social Security. So I think it's important to have one. I think the Canadian idea is a way of addressing the issue of how much do we want the tax to fall on different generations, which is, to my mind, a very legitimate element. The Canadians have passed a law that says when you do an expansion of the system, that expansion has to be fully funded, even though the system as a whole is meant to be only 20% funded. So there are real issues about different cohorts, and a trust fund, it seems to me, is the right way to address it. A trust fund 100% in Treasury bonds is not what I would choose, but what I would choose would be very dependent on what else you did in terms of connecting benefits to the returns on the trust fund. If the only thing that happened, if the stock market crashed, is it changed the date of when you have to legislate because you're about to run out of money, that's not a good risk allocation device. But if you had some sensible package of what you were doing with higher and lower revenues, spreading the risk around, I think the idea that Alicia Manel has just put forth again with co-authors of having the trust fund go partially into stocks is a sound one if it's done well.
There is indeed a very strong rationale for the trust fund. Trust fund is a bit of a misnomer. In reality, it is merely a buffer fund. And the rationale is that it is the means by which we can stabilize the contribution rate. That 6.2% contribution rate is stabilized if we accumulate the reserves. And the whole concept, the whole structure is that we do, in fact, have an escalating cost year by year going through the 75-year projection period, and we would have a payroll tax rate that would average around 6.2%, start out much lower and end much, much higher. So the trust fund serves the role of stabilizing that rate at 6.2 throughout the entire 75-year period, and merely accumulates reserves, not really a trust fund. In my view, it's a buffer fund, a stabilization reserve fund.
I'm not going to say anything. Sitting next to a Nobel Prize winner and an actuary, I think. Nothing to add here.
Smart move. Other questions? Right here in front.
Thank you very much. I'm Hideaki Kikuchi from government, Japanese government. My question is, how to explain the citizens about the relationship between their increasing tax rates or utilizing the others' tax resources and social security benefits paying. So Japanese experiences in 2011, we paid national pension benefits by utilizing unscheduled financial resources such as earned surplus available from Japanese railway, construction, transportations, special accounts to their paying national pension benefits. At that time, we faced a very difficult about how to explain utilizing these special accounts for paying social security benefits. Or these problems are very difficult to, what is the relationship between the raising taxes and paying social security benefits? What do you think about how to explain the citizens understandable this problem?
I'm not quite sure I fully followed the question. Can we perhaps rephrase it? Kathryn, can you help here?
Did I get you correct that you, or understand you correctly, that you wanted to, how you can explain the financing system and increases in taxes when someone's not going to see an increase in benefits in the same year? You're going to pay a higher tax in one year, but you will not see that benefit go up in that same year because of the way that the program is financed.
Yes, basically the funding or the financing is controlled by the schedule of benefits that are promised. So it is the actuarial value of the expected scheduled benefits that determine the level of the contribution, the FICA contribution. And yes, you're right that it does look as though, from an individual perspective, there is an escalation in the cost and no increase in the benefit. But the nature of the changing economic and demographic scenario over time does demand that we address the reality of the thing, that it does not have a constant cost. It has an escalating cost. And the only way you can meet that escalating cost, one way or another, is to escalate the revenue flowing in. And I think that was the whole point of this particular session, was to address ways of increasing the revenue, but specifically not touching in any way the benefits. Now, in reality, if we came to reform and we had very substantial need for benefit for financing increases, it may make sense to restructure the benefit to give a little bit of a benefit increase, perhaps particularly at the lower level. So I think what we are constrained by on this particular panel are the specific terms of reference to address revenue enhancement only. You are correct, it's a much, much bigger picture, and if we get to 2033 under Peter's scenario, bigger questions will need to be asked, and the adequacy and the reasonableness of the allocation would have to be addressed also.
And the National Academy of Social Insurance, under my predecessor Virginia Reno's supervision, did several polls on public attitudes towards Social Security. And one of the findings was that if you tell people that, ask people, are they willing to pay more in taxes in order to ensure that benefits will still be there for them, that the benefits won't be cut, in order to make sure that the benefits are shored up, most people, and by large margins, are willing to pay more in order to make sure that they don't suffer that harm in retirement.
Other questions? We have so many things we want to pay for, so many benefit expansions. No other revenue questions? Okay, right here.
Sort of in answer to the last gentleman's question, would it make sense to think about or talk about the fact that the social contract is changing from when I was born in the 40s? And the idea was that the employer was that our social welfare system was based in large part on employer contributions, employer providing health care, employer providing Social Security, retirement benefits. And that's much less true now. There's been a big shift starting in the 70s that the only thing a corporation's supposed to do is to maximize shareholder value, and that we therefore need to have a new type of social contract where more of the benefits come from us collectively to us collectively. And maybe that would help the explanation and reassure the millennials.
I know, Michael Lind has worked a lot on this concept of the social contract and how it's changed over time, so I would well, no, I think certainly it's important to answer your question and respond to your question, to talk about the values that underlie these programs, talk about the social contract. If you want to persuade people to support a program, you have to give a rationale for its importance. And in terms of the disappearance of the role of the employer, again, as I mentioned briefly before, there are possibilities of working more flexibly with consumers being that matching entity rather than the employer or the government, either one, but we need to give a lot more thought to that.
Anybody else? We still have a few more minutes for questions.
Let me go back to the last one. There's an extended discussion among economists focused on investment and corporate behavior, that the idea that the only role of a corporation is dealing with the shareholders, if you will. In jargon, the principal agent problem is between the shareholders and management. And that is being viewed increasingly as a bad way to run an economy. And it seems to me that a corporation gets limited liability. That's something that the society or the government provides as an advantage. And so there is another principal agent problem between the society and corporations. And I think exploring this the relationship to workers is an integral part of that, but it's not the only part. And it would be good to have the broad expansion. And of course, in some countries, Germany is a prime example, the workers have a say in the directors, and that's the broader sense of what cooperation is about, which may or may not be a different complementing framework for social contract.
Yes, a question for Peter, really related to your earlier comments about 2033 and the likelihood of Treasury borrowing, which I guess in a way is a related topic here. I was wondering about what do you think the implications of that would be for Social Security going forward from that point in terms of, I mean, do you worry that that would be something that would be destabilizing from a political standpoint for Social Security? What does it mean? I mean, we have Medicare, which is a mixed revenue model. It sounds like Social Security could wind up in a similar situation with dependence on payroll tax, plus, I suppose you'd say general revenue or borrowing.
I think that's right. My hope, first of all, I think the borrowing is politically very hard to avoid, because I think if we don't have borrowing, we're going to have politically too large benefit cuts. So the politicians will see borrowing as a politically more attractive option. My hope is the borrowing will be done on a basis with full payback. So the legislation not only achieves the ability to pay the benefits in the usual actuarial way, but that's being done while paying off this debt in full with the interest at the standard Treasury rate. And so it doesn't end up like Medicare with a regular general revenue contribution. I think Medicare, details of Medicare are more vulnerable than those of Social Security, in part because health care is a lot more expensive, a lot more complicated than writing checks. But secondly, because the general revenues are involved. The discussion is much more year to year, and the goal for Social Security is to have infrequent times to review and rethink, probably more often than we've been doing, since we only tend to do it in crises, although it was different when it was expansions that were happening. So I think it depends a whole lot how it is done, and not just that it is done.
Other questions? So I have one for the group. If I were to be deciding between your three proposals, the kind of argument for what Ken is proposing is that it keeps the nature of my wages are taxed and that pays for my benefits, and it goes from workers' wages straight to workers' benefits. Ben, your and Peter's proposals essentially brings a new wedge into that. So can you think of perhaps a more appropriate program for your sources of revenue to be spent on, as opposed to Social Security, and what the argument would be for them? So if you had to dedicate the estate tax to a program for, say, helping to build community centers in rural areas where there's less access to retirement homes, why that would be a worse off place to spend money than Social Security?
In a way, part of the argument is I think the estate tax is a terrific tax. It's just about the best tax we have.
It's also my favorite tax. I agree with you completely.
So the question is, with all of this pressure to get rid of it, what do we do with it that will give it political support? So in part, my response here is as much about helping the payroll tax as it is about helping Social Security. The second thing is the public knows that, much of the public knows that their contributions are not financing their own benefits. They're financing current benefits, and that's the way the system goes. And so I don't know that we need the tight link. I don't think the progressive proposal is one that would be a problem. I know a number of countries have an exempt amount. Some of it just say you don't collect if total income is less than a certain amount, but some of them say The first $3,000 you earn is not subject to tax. After that, it's a flat tax. So that's a two-part progressive structure. I haven't heard of anyone finding that being a problem. So I think, or I'd like to think, you're raising an issue we don't have to worry about.
Ben, a better use of investment income taxes?
I mean, there's many. Of course, I'm not going to speak against good, quality nursing homes. I think that's certainly a good use of money. You could use it for many different purposes. I do think there's a fundamental principle of, shared prosperity being something that our economy should be able to achieve, and if the fruits of growth are, not being shared across the income spectrum, and that causes problems in Social Security's financing, I think it makes sense to think about ways of dealing with that. But certainly you could use investment income for many other purposes as well.
Ben, can I?
Sure.
I think, and this goes back to the description of the Anasi polls, sending money to Washington is a no-no. Using money for Social Security because otherwise we can't pay benefits, that's widely accepted. I think you got to ask the question, what else can we raise money for? And I view Social Security, that's why Peter and I wrote, it's only if it's in danger that we wanted to see it used for Social Security to protect it, because Social Security is the best wheel we have for raising taxes.
Let me just comment, if I were to be directing part of the estate tax and part of the tax on investment into Social Security and had completely satisfied the funding deficits and there's money left over, I think the next option would be to address the problem of subsidizing college education, college student education.
Great. All right, well, thank you, gentlemen, very much for your proposals.